And joining me now to discuss that, we have Karl Smith. I'm sorry. I'm just if you're just tuning in, I should say that I was just talking about Ben Bernanke and his performance this week, and the fact that it appears to me that he is attempting to get Mitt Romney elected president because the Fed is sitting on its hands idle while we have an unemployment and labor crisis in this country. Peter Schiff is going to disagree strongly and vehemently with that. But right now we have Karl Smith, assistant professor of economics and government at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, contributor to the blog Model Behavior at Forbes.com. Betsy Stevenson, assistant professor of business and public policy at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School and former chief economist in the Obama Labor Department. Dedrick Muhammed, senior director of the economic department for the NAACP, and the aforementioned Peter Schiff, president of the brokerage firm Euro-Pacific Capital, former economic advisor to Ron Paul's 2008 presidential campaign, and author of The Real Crash, America's Coming Bankruptcy, former candidate for the Connecticut Republican Senate nomination. And because I made Peter sit through an 8-minute monologue in which he disagreed with every word, including and the, I will give you the floor first to respond.
Yeah, first of all, I think you overestimate what the Fed can do to help the economy. You don't create economic growth or jobs by printing money. What you do create is bubbles and inflation. You have to remember, it was the artificially low interest rates that were the principal cause of the housing bubble, and therefore the Fed is to blame for the financial crisis that ensued. So right now, we don't need more cheap money. Right? That is preventing the economy from restructuring along the lines that would actually give us lasting economic growth. We need much higher interest rates. Of course, that's going to bring on some short-term pain, but unfortunately, we need that to get the long-term gain.
This is the liquidationist Andrew Carnegie. Let the prices let prices find a bottom. Let there be suffering and mass misery, and that mass misery will kind of wrench the pain out of the system.
Remember, there's more misery if we don't bite the bullet, and we didn't follow Andrew Carnegie's advice during the 1920s. Hoover ignored it. He did what Obama is doing. He did what Roosevelt was doing. That's why the Depression lasted through the end of the Second World War.
I'm not the economist at the table, so I'll throw it over to you guys, but I want to make two points in response to that. One, in terms of whether the Fed did or did not cause a housing bubble. I think one of the things that's important to recognize is that if you look at the history of capitalist economies, there are all sorts of bubbles that happen all the time, right? Throughout the history of capitalist economies, sometimes with central banks, sometimes without them. In fact, in Manias, Panics, and Crashes, Kilderberger looks at, and this is the sort of canonical text, right, on financial crashes, is that even when you don't have a central bank, they come up with ways to fund the bubbles, right? So,
yeah, but it's much bigger when you have a central bank and a government and fiat money, and we're going to suffer. But, the real fiscal cliff is not this phony one that we're talking about at the end of the year when the budget deficit might actually come down a little bit. The fiscal cliff is when interest rates skyrocket and the government can't afford to pay the interest on the enormity of the debt that's been accumulated in the last few years.
Karl, I want you to respond to this. I mean, the one other thing I'll say is, I think it's important to distinguish, and I think Bernanke does and other people who study this, distinguish between how the Fed is operating in normal times and how it's operating in post-crisis times, right? I mean,
a crisis that it caused.
Things are different when you have the fallout from a financial crisis.
That it caused.
Right. So well, first of all, I mean, I don't know what point we want to debate this at, because I probably disagree with everything you said, but
well, you'd be wrong.
But so I don't think there's a lot of evidence that the Fed caused the housing bubble.
Oh, well, remember, I predicted it in advance. I was alone in that. And the reason I knew about it was because I understand how the Fed was.
You were not alone in predicting the housing bubble.
I was.
You were not alone.
Oh,
so you
check it out on YouTube.
No. You were against some of the guys on Wall Street who also don't really know what they're talking about. And
well, I won't disagree with you there.
But I said there was a bubble. Paul Krugman came and gave a talk in 2007 about how there was going to be a housing bubble.
Well, he wanted one. He advocated for it. He thought it was going to solve our problem.
Dean Baker, I should note, also said this. But continue.
And so lots of us thought that there was a bubble. I mean,
did they also predict a financial crisis from when it would burst?
I mean, I did.
But all right. Well, I didn't see you out there with me, but all right.
But furthermore, I mean, so we had lots of securitization. We had CDOs. We had all these products, and I think that was probably at the heart of what caused the bubble. And we could talk a lot about.
Well, it was the Fannie and Freddie guarantees and the cheap money.
Okay, let's get off the cause. I don't want to talk about the cause right now because I want to talk about what we can do now. And I think there is this open question. And people on the left and the right, I was making a strong case there for Fed action that Fed could do things. People say there's nothing the Fed could do. It's quote pushing on a string. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I mean, what the Fed could easily do is simply say that it's willing to tolerate a little bit more inflation, that it would allow inflation to go up to 3%. And I mean, we can sit and argue about what we really think inflation is, but we can say this: we measure the PCE deflator, right? We can say
explain what that is. Explain what that is.
But so
let's keep it.
Yeah. Personal consumption expenditures is a part of GDP. It's what normal people buy.
It's a basket of goods.
That people buy. We go out. The government goes out and buys it every month, and then writes down.
Literally, it's this amazingly thorough process in which they go out and they buy the goods.
They buy it.
Hold on one second. Hold on one second.
They calculate how much it costs, right? And so we can just say, look, we'll let that go to 3%, or we'll let that go to 4%.
Yeah, but how does making that basket more expensive help people? How does it help the economy if they have to pay more for food?
Okay, so there's several ways.
The Fed has. Oh, sorry.
Okay. There's several ways. The most straightforward way is that when that happens because people are spending more money, people are buying more stuff. I mean, you believe in supply and demand, right? So prices go up.
But supply doesn't go up.
Prices go up.
Just demand. So prices rise.
So demand goes up, right? And then that makes businesses want to supply more stuff. They can do this now because we have unemployed workers who they can hire and then make things.
No, we just import the stuff from China. We get our trade deficit goes up.
Here's a prime example of this, right? So we talk about the car industry, and this I also predicted. We're going to get into predictions. Right, which is that we would have a surge in new car sales. They would go up to 14 million, right? And that would result in workers in the Midwest being rehired. And we've seen the unemployment rate in Michigan and in Ohio start to collapse. We've grown manufacturing jobs for the first time in something like 20 years. We have growth in manufacturing jobs, and that's happening because people are buying more cars.
But inflation is not going to create jobs. It's just going to create more misery for the people who are unemployed.
But think for a second about how you get inflation, right? So it's not
money printing. That's how you get it.
So, but it's not as if you print money and then magically prices go up. Right.
Well, sometimes it prevents prices from falling, but it's always damaging the economy.
It's not by magic, right? so there's supply and demand.
Yeah, and when you have too much money being supplied, prices rise.
Betsy.
Okay, so first of all, that is actually not the relationship between the monetary supply and prices. It's not a direct relationship between prices and monetary supply. There's this other thing that you learn in your first year economics class, which is velocity, and how many times those dollars turn over. So what we're measuring...
Velocity, 820. Okay.
But
which is how quickly the money...
But this is why it's important that we actually measure prices, because we need to find out what's happening to prices, and it's not enough to say what are we doing to the money supply. So we look and see what's happening to prices. And I should add, we measure prices, and one of the big mistakes we make when we measure prices is we never know how much to adjust for quality. So we know quality is rising, so our price increases might even be lower than.
Well, a lot of times quality is going down. Have you been on an airplane lately? There's a lot of price declines that don't get captured into the CPI.
But the way to think about what the Fed does is the Fed has two policies. It's two mandates, right? It's trying to think about employment, maximum employment, and it's trying to think about inflation. So the question isn't how does having higher inflation help people. What we're trying to do is do something that's not that's not very extremely precise, right? We're trying to target something that we have a hard time measuring, that we're not exactly sure how things are going to respond, and we're trying to target two separate things. We're trying to target employment, and we're trying to target prices. And we've got to tolerate missing a little bit on prices and missing a little bit on employment.
I want to talk about the politics of this and the pressure that comes from either side and the kind of questions that Bernanke faces at the Joint Economic Committee right after we take a break. Well, it's Saturday at 8:24 a.m. and we are debating monetary policy. We talked about the Fed. I want to zoom out for just one layer of detail because I think one way to understand this, the way that I understand it, is that there are different pressures on the Federal Reserve to act in different ways, and what I see when I watched the testimony yesterday, the Joint Economic Committee, is that there's one political party that very explicitly is saying the kinds of things that you're saying, Peter. You're saying that inflation is higher than the official headline number, that the Fed doing things like quantitative easing, which is one of the sort of unconventional things they did during the crisis to try to increase the monetary supply and kickstart the economy, that's a disastrous path to follow. Ron Paul obviously has made these ideas quite famous, but it's spread throughout the Republican Party. It's now a kind of central Republican Party
but I would
idea.
say most Republicans don't understand how bad it's going to get when the Fed does the right thing after having done the wrong thing for so long. When they finally let interest rates go up, it's going to be very problematic for a country that is so over-leveraged. Banks are going to fail. The government's going to have to default on a lot of its obligations. Because if you just think about how much we've borrowed, you mentioned what happened under Paul Volcker. Let's say in a couple of years, the official funded debt is $20 trillion. If interest rates go to 10%, it's going to cost us $1 trillion a year just to pay the interest on the national debt.
People have been predicting the interest rate spikes for a while. They've been predicting very high levels of inflation.
And it's going to happen.
It has not happened yet. But let me ask you, I want to ask you this, because you're obviously the views that you hold and that are, I think, broadly in the sort of same conceptual area as Ron Paul and other people. Do you think that those views have become more popular among the Republican Party and have been articulated more over time?
First, actually, my math was wrong. It's $2 trillion a year in interest at 20 trillion.
Sure.
So that's the entire tax collection. But look, I don't think that people understand how the Fed's role, how instrumental it has been to creating all of the macroeconomic problems that are plaguing us right now. Because by keeping interest rates too low for too long, it has screwed up the economy. We don't save enough. We don't produce enough. We have too many people working in the service sector, in government, in banking, in retail, in healthcare, and education. Meanwhile, we can't produce the things that we need to consume. We have $50 billion a month trade deficits because this economy doesn't work anymore because all the resources are misallocated. It's going to be painful to put them back together. But if we don't do it, we're going to have a real crash in this country that's going to make 2008 look like prosperity.
Dedrick, jump in real quick.
Yes, you can. Please. Dedrick, how are you? Nice to see you.
I just want to put forward, I think the focus, the conversation has kind of been overly focused in one particular area. I don't see how we can blame the entire recession or the whole fiscal crisis upon the Fed. And I also don't really see that the solution to everything is going to be strictly in monetary policy. I think most people generally agree that there is, and even in your introduction, you talked about that there's an overall political crisis. And I think it would behoove us to talk more about how maybe the Fed fits into that. But it's not just the Fed or nothing, and the Fed's going to solve it, because I don't believe just
the Congress did help. It wasn't only the Fed.
That's a really important point, and it's in fact the point that Bernanke made in his testimony, which was he said, I need some help from Congress. You guys have a job too. Fiscal policy and monetary policy work together, and nobody.
But he's wrong, and he knows that, right? So we can say whatever, but
Bernanke's wrong.
Bernanke's wrong.
Well, he lies too. He's not just wrong.
What monetarists on the right and Keynesians on the left came to understanding of in the 90s or whatever is that the primary driver of business cycles is action by the Federal Reserve.
Well, they were wrong.
Ben Bernanke can alleviate the entire recession by himself if he so chose.
No, he can't. He could make it much worse.
No, but here's my point, though.
And he has said that.
Here's my point. Here's my meta point, which is important, and I think for people at home this is very important. Peter Schiff, your views have a lot of traction in the Republican Party.
Not really. Maybe with Ron Paul, but not. He's not the typical Republican.
Well, here, look. I'll show you. Let's show Mitt Romney talking about Ben Bernanke. Just as an example of this. This is a question at an NBC debate about whether Mitt Romney would reappoint Ben Bernanke.
Would Ben Bernanke have a job in your administration?
No, I'd be looking for somebody new. I think Ben Bernanke has overinflated the amount of currency that he's created. QE2 did not work. It did not get Americans back to work. It did not get the economy going again.
Now, my point here is that the position that you just said, Karl, you just said Ben Bernanke can solve this by himself, which is a view you never hear articulated anywhere in politics. My point is that there is an asymmetric there's an asymmetry in politics and in the debate we have, which is that the views that Peter have articulated have gained a lot of traction. They're known on the internet. I didn't realize until very recently that there was essentially the view that you were articulating, and in fact that a lot of economists have been saying, right, that the Fed is doing too little, that actually the Fed could solve the business cycle. And so what it seems to me is that the seesaw is being sat on only on one side, and that's part of what's producing the Fed in action.
So it has been. Literally every single mainstream economist I know thinks the Fed has done too little. And
that's the problem. These guys are wrong.
This is actually a really, really unusual time for the Fed because the Fed has often, over its history, faced political pressure, but it's actually usually from the left. Political pressure because it's not doing enough about employment. And this is a very new time where it's facing a lot of political pressure from the right, from people who are paranoid about inflation going crazy and are really paranoid about how they act. And I think that they have to respond to this pressure, because one of the things we know when we look at the history of central banking is that an independent central bank is actually what prevents inflation from getting out of control.
Right.
And what they're fearful of is losing that independence, because we know that if we turn our central banking over to people like Ron Paul, we will end up with a disaster. Oh. And so they've got to balance a very tight line of being able to work within the political system and not lose that independence, but yet do the actions that we want them to do in order to, help the economy.
Remember, inflation is going to run out of control. It's going to devastate the economy. The Fed has no tools now to contain it, because if they have to raise interest rates in order to fight the inflation genie that they've let out of the bottle, the U.S. government's going to have to default on its bonds. We're going to have failures in the banking system without any bailouts. It's going to be a much bigger collapse than what happened in 2008.
When are we going to have the inflation?
It's already here. Have you bought it?
All right, we have this on.
Have you been to a supermarket?
Gas prices going down.
We have this on video.
I want a real bet. Do you have to go?
Peter Schiff, president of the brokerage firm Euro Pacific Capital. Thank you for your time this morning. I really appreciate it. How Bill Clinton messed up Barack Obama's week. Up next.
We can have a bet.